March 15, 1945. A gray morning hangs low over the frozen fields outside Mertzwiller, a small Alsatian village scarred by months of retreating war. Snowmelt has turned the soil into a cold, clinging mud, and every breath carries the metallic taste of cordite. An American platoon lies pinned against the earth, unable to lift their heads as a German MG-42 tears long, disciplined bursts across the field. The gun's sound, a harsh, vibrating roar, cuts through the landscape like a saw through timber. Shell fragments hum overhead, splinters of bark snap from shattered trees. Amid the chaos, one shape moves. Slowly, deliberately. A lone American infantryman presses his chest to the mud and begins to crawl forward, inch by inch, as if time itself has slowed to watch. His helmet scrapes softly against frozen ground, his fingers digging into the earth to pull his body forward against the storm of machine gun fire. German soldiers, confident behind their weapon, jeer at the absurd sight of a single man moving toward certain death. Yet he keeps going, unwavering, closing distance no one else dares to cross. And to understand how this crawling figure will shatter a German strongpoint in seconds, we must first understand the war that brought him here to wwii. Early 1945, the Western Front had become a long, grinding corridor of exhaustion. The Allies had broken through Normandy, fought across France, and survived the desperate fury of the Ardennes counteroffensive, but the war was far from over. Germany, though battered and shrinking, still clung fiercely to every remaining mile of territory west of the Rhine. The winter had been brutal. Snowdrifts, freezing rain, and mud turned every movement into a test of endurance, and though the Allies held the advantage in numbers and industry, they were now confronting an enemy defending its own doorstep. The collapse predicted after the Battle of the Bulge had not materialized. Instead, the German army redirected its remaining strength to the Alsace region, launching Operation Nordwind in a final attempt to split American forces and reclaim lost ground. Villages, forests, and ridgelines became contested zones, each one fortified and defended with the grim understanding that time, and the war itself, was running out. In this shifting landscape stood the American 7th Army, pushing toward the Rhine with the knowledge that every day mattered. The 7th Army's divisions, many of them under strength after months of combat, were tasked with clearing the last German footholds in Alsace. What looked on a map like a simple drive toward the river was, in reality, a series of hard, close-range fights against well-prepared enemy positions. German commanders, knowing they could no longer maneuver as they once had, reverted to a defensive doctrine that had served them well earlier in the war. Interlocking machine gun nests supported by mortars, mines, and carefully chosen fields of fire. These strong points did not require large numbers of troops. A few well-hidden MG-42 teams, placed at commanding vantage points, could bring entire companies of attackers to a halt. Their weapon, capable of firing more than 1,000 rounds per minute, dominated open ground and forced infantry to crawl, hug the earth, and hope for the smallest chance to advance. Alsace, with its mix of open farmland, soaked riverbanks, and dense patches of forest, was ideal terrain for such defenses. A single machine gun, positioned in a barn window or behind a hedgerow, could sweep across an entire field. Mines were buried along likely avenues of approach, usually invisible until triggered. Mortar teams waited farther back, ready to drop shells on any group of soldiers who managed to gather for an assault. Every step forward was paid for in sweat, fear, and blood, and American infantrymen learned quickly that what appeared to be an empty field might instead be a carefully arranged killing zone. The victories of Normandy and the liberation of Paris felt distant here. In this cold and scarred corner of France, the war had shrunk back to its most primitive form. Two lines of men, each struggling for yards. Mertzwiller was one such obstacle, a village small enough to disappear on most maps, yet stubborn enough to halt entire battalions. Its stone houses and narrow streets concealed defenders who knew exactly how to turn a modest settlement into a fortress. German forces withdrawing from the north had gathered there, preparing to slow the American advance long enough for others to retreat across the Rhine. They placed their machine gun nests at points where they could cover open fields with overlapping arcs of fire. They sighted their weapons to strike the first place an American platoon would appear. They dug trenches, laid mines, and created fallback pockets inside the village so that even when one position fell, another could continue fighting. These were not troops expecting victory. These were soldiers determined to make every American advance cost as dearly as possible. The American infantry approaching the village knew what awaited them. They had seen the aftermath of German defensive lines before, burned-out fields, abandoned gun positions, and the bodies of men who had tried to cross too quickly. They understood that in these final months of the war, German units no longer possessed the mobility of earlier years, yet their resolve to fight remained disturbingly intact. The 7th Army's objective was straightforward on paper: clear Mertzwiller, secure the surrounding ground, and push east toward the Rhine. But tasks written in clean military language seldom matched the brutal reality on the front line. For the men of the platoon advancing across the field that morning, the mission distilled into a simpler truth. Somewhere ahead, an MG-42 was waiting, its crew disciplined, its weapon ready, its position chosen with precision. And before any tank could roll, before any artillery could be brought to bear, someone would have to face that machine gun directly. For all the massive movements being planned at Army headquarters, crossings of rivers, encirclements, drives toward Germany's industrial heartlands, the fate of those grand operations depended on moments like the one now forming outside the village. It was here, at ground level, that plans became reality. It was here that battalions slowed, faltered, or moved forward depending on whether a single machine gun nest lived or died. And it was here, on this cold March morning, that one American platoon found itself pinned by a gun position that refused to yield. Their advance had barely begun when the first burst carved through the air, forcing men down into the mud. The field before them suddenly seemed vast, exposed, and impossibly hostile. They could not fall back. The attack had to continue. They could not remain where they were. The MG-42 would mow them down. Something had to change, and the solution to that problem would come not from strategy, nor from orders, but from one man within the platoon. And to understand him, the quiet, steady soldier who would soon begin to crawl toward the impossible, we must step closer to the life that shaped him. Long before he found himself crawling through the mud of Alsace, Silvestre Herrera had grown up in a world far removed from the thunder of artillery. Born in Chihuahua, Mexico, and raised from childhood in the dry heat of Arizona, his early life was shaped by quiet resilience rather than violence. He worked long hours as a farm laborer, harvesting crops beneath the relentless desert sun. The United States was already at war when he came of age, but Herrera believed he was just another young man destined to remain on the periphery of great events. Then came the letter informing him that he was exempt from the draft, a discovery that might have kept him home, safe and far from the collapsing cities of Europe. Yet the exemption did not comfort him. Instead, it confronted him with a decision. While others were being sent to fight, he felt a responsibility he could not ignore. In a choice few around him fully understood, Herrera walked into a recruiting office and volunteered for service, trading the quiet certainty of farm work for the unknown world of infantry combat. Basic training reshaped him. He learned to handle the M1 Garand, to march long distances with aching shoulders, to follow orders in the cold precision demanded by war. But no amount of drilling could prepare a man for what awaited in the European theater. By the time Herrera joined the 36th Infantry Division, the storied Texas Division, hardened by brutal campaigns in Italy and southern France, he had stepped into the ranks of an outfit known for its endurance and sacrifice. The 36th had forced river crossings under fire, survived the mountains of northern Italy, and absorbed casualties that would have shattered less experienced units. New arrivals like Herrera entered an environment where every soldier carried personal memories of narrow escapes and lost friends. It was a place where courage was not spoken of, but expected. As winter tightened over Europe, the 36th Division pressed into Alsace, tasked with clearing villages still held by German forces. Herrera's platoon was one small part of this effort, a force of fewer than 40 men advancing through terrain unfamiliar and unforgiving. The snow had begun to melt, leaving the ground soft, slick, and treacherous. Every footfall threatened to reveal a mine or draw the attention of a hidden German observer. The men scanned tree lines, hedgerows, and windows for movement, but the danger they feared most came not from snipers or stray rifle fire. It came from the sudden eruption of a machine gun, the weapon whose presence could turn progression into paralysis. German MG teams had mastered the art of blending into their surroundings. Their nests were seldom crude holes in the ground. More often they were carefully constructed pits lined with timber, camouflaged with branches, and positioned to command the widest field of fire. The MG-42, their principal tool, did not require long bursts to pin down a platoon. A few controlled sweeps across open terrain would force any group of men to the earth, afraid to raise their heads. With its blistering rate of fire, it could shred small trees, tear through fence posts, and rip apart anyone caught in the open. The Americans knew this all too well. The moment they recognized the distinct, ripping buzz sound of an MG-42, their bodies reacted automatically, dropping low, searching for cover that often did not exist. Herrera was no stranger to danger by the time his platoon reached the outskirts of Mertzwiller. They had pushed through hamlets where houses still smoldered, fields where shell holes filled with icy water, and woods where every step carried the threat of a tripwire. The mission briefing that morning had been simple: advance across the open field, seize the tree line ahead, and break into the village. Nothing in the calm voice of the commanding officer hinted at the violence that would erupt in minutes. Yet seasoned infantrymen understood that simplicity on paper often masked the complexity of what awaited them. A field to cross could hide everything: mines, concealed pits, or an MG nest waiting for the first squad to step into view. As the platoon moved forward, cautious but confident, they did not yet know the exact position of the machine gun that would soon halt their advance. A few steps more, a few breaths later, and the German crew opened fire, the first burst ripping the silence apart and plunging the men into the dirt. Herrera fell with the rest, his heart pounding against the cold ground, the earth vibrating with each consecutive burst. In that moment, the careful planning of officers dissolved. The platoon was pinned, the field ahead unreachable, and the gun before them almost perfectly placed. It was a scene countless American units had faced during the war: the sudden realization that the next move was impossible unless someone acted. Herrera lay still, processing the situation with a clarity that surprised even him. The minefields, the exposed terrain, the lack of artillery support, all of it formed a picture he understood instinctively. If the machine gun remained active, the platoon could neither retreat nor advance. Someone had to close the distance. Someone had to go forward. And though no order had yet been spoken, the task began to settle on him like a weight he could not ignore. What began as a defensive reaction, lying low, staying alive, was shifting toward something else, something that would soon define his legacy. And as Herrera prepared himself for what he sensed he must do, the war around him constricted to a single point: a German machine gun nest, a field of mud, and the first hesitant movement that would become the crawl scene by friend and foe alike. The human experience of being pinned beneath machine gun fire is unlike any other moment in war. For the men of Herrera's platoon, the world narrowed instantly to the cold mud beneath their bodies and the savage rhythm of the MG-42 tearing overhead. Sound became physical, a hammering vibration that seemed to strike the air itself. Dirt leapt upward with each burst, stinging exposed skin. Helmets pressed tighter to skulls as if pushed by invisible hands. In those seconds, fear did not shout, it whispered, reminding each man that raising his head even an inch might expose him to the weapon's unrelenting fury. Herrera felt this fear too, but something inside him refused to let it root. He absorbed the sensory chaos, the chattering gun, the bark splintering from a nearby tree, the desperate breathing of the men around him, and found a steady center. War had stripped away the abstractions of patriotism and strategy. All that remained was the stark truth that if no one acted, the platoon would remain trapped in that field until the machine gun destroyed them one by one. The decision forming inside him was not born of words or commands. It was the quiet resolve of a man who saw a task no one else could survive and accepted the weight of it without hesitation. Tactically, everything favored the German position. The MG-42 sat at a slight elevation, giving its crew a perfect angle over the field. The terrain, deceptively gentle in its contours, offered few natural depressions deep enough to conceal movement. What small folds existed were scattered irregularly, requiring the attacker to move slowly, nearly flat against the earth, praying that each inch forward would not draw the gunner's eye. American infantry doctrine taught fire and maneuver, one element providing covering fire while another advanced. But in this barren stretch of ground, there was no way to generate meaningful suppressive fire without exposing riflemen to immediate death. The rifle barrels could not compete with the volume or intensity of the MG42. Even the platoon's Browning automatic rifle, usually reliable for suppressive bursts, remained silent. The gunner could not rise high enough to fire without becoming a target. The unit was effectively frozen, its tactical options collapsing into a single, bleak reality. Someone would have to crawl into the belly of the weapon's field of fire and close the distance manually. To most soldiers, this was a prospect so grim it bordered on madness. A lone figure exposed on open ground had no right to survive. Yet Herrera studied the terrain calmly, noticing the shallow dips, the dark patches of wet soil, the slight swells left by earlier shell bursts. These were not perfect cover, but they were enough to reduce his silhouette if he moved slowly enough not to draw the German gunner's immediate attention, slowly enough to use the rhythm of the bursts as a shield. The tactical problem was nearly insoluble, but Herrera saw not impossibility, only necessity. Inside the German machine gun nest, the perspective was entirely different but no less intense. The crew, trained with precision and hardened by years of war, operated the MG42 with cold efficiency. The gunner maintained his grip, sweeping the weapon across the field in short, disciplined bursts designed to conserve ammunition while keeping pressure on the Americans. The assistant gunner fed the ammunition belt with practiced motions, glancing occasionally through the nest's narrow slit to track any sign of movement. From their vantage point, the enemy platoon was little more than a scattering of helmets pressed against the ground. They had seen this scene before, attackers caught in the open, plans shattered, momentum broken. The Germans felt no triumph, only the grim satisfaction of knowing their position held, for now. When the gunner first noticed the faint shift of a body, a subtle slide through the mud, he hesitated. The movement was almost too slow to be real. But then it happened again, a small advance, deliberate and steady. At first, they laughed, not loudly, but with the dark humor of soldiers who believed the field itself would kill this crawling American long before they needed to adjust their fire. No one crawled toward an MG42 and survived. It defied reason, training, and experience. Yet the figure kept moving, almost imperceptibly at first, then with a rhythm that suggested intent rather than panic. The gunner repositioned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he began to track this strange, stubborn silhouette approaching through the mud. What began as mockery soon turned to caution, then to disbelief, and finally to the realization that this single man was now becoming their most dangerous threat. And as the German gunner focused on that slow, determined crawl, every angle, human, tactical, and enemy, converged toward the moment when the true nature of Herrera's resolve would reveal itself. The MG42 was more than a weapon. It was an industrial solution to battlefield dominance. Designed for rapid production and devastating effectiveness, its firing rate created a sound so distinct that Allied troops often mistook it for multiple guns firing at once. Each burst carved the air with a mechanical ferocity unmatched by any Allied machine gun. Yet the weapon had its vulnerabilities. Its extreme rate of fire required constant barrel changes, and its effectiveness relied on stable positioning, a steady ammunition supply, and a gunner capable of maintaining discipline under pressure. Against a coordinated assault, or under artillery fire, an MG42 could be neutralized. But on open ground, where cover was scarce and attackers were forced to expose themselves, it was nearly invincible. The American soldiers in Herrera's platoon carried their own tools, the reliable M1 Garand, its 8-round clip ringing sharply when empty, fragmentation grenades designed for close assaults, and the Browning automatic rifle for short bursts of suppressive fire. None of these matched the sheer brutality of the MG42, but together, in the hands of determined infantry, they formed a system meant to overcome even the deadliest defensive positions. Mines complicated everything. Invisible beneath the mud, they could maim or kill without warning, shaping the battlefield more effectively than any rifle or machine gun. For a soldier attempting to close with an enemy nest, The possibility of mines was a silent, constant threat. Yet to Herrera, these dangers were not reasons to hesitate. They were simply conditions he accepted as part of the task. His mind absorbed the technological imbalance and moved beyond it, focusing instead on the path that remained. What pushed a man forward under such conditions was not easily explained. It was not simple bravery, nor a disregard for danger. It was something quieter, more internal, the recognition that in the chaos of battle, someone must act to save the many. At that moment, Herrera was not thinking about honor or medals, nor even about the larger war unfolding across continents. His thoughts were rooted in the immediate world around him, the men lying helpless beside him, the chatter of the machine gun, the cold mud against his palms, and the knowledge that remaining still would eventually mean death for them all. The moral weight of war often reveals itself in such moments, not through speeches or ideals, but through instinctive choices made in the span of seconds. Herrera's crawl began not with a dramatic gesture, but with a small shift of his body, a commitment to move forward even when logic argued against it. This decision, grounded in loyalty and responsibility, carried with it a profound emotional gravity. Soldiers do not choose to become symbols. They choose to protect the men beside them, and only later does history acknowledge what those moments meant. As Herrera inched forward, the platoon behind him understood they were witnessing something rare, a man who, fully aware of the cost, accepted it without hesitation. The moral dimension of courage is often invisible on the battlefield, but here it was embodied in a single figure advancing through the mud. Leadership during such moments does not always come from rank. The officers and sergeants of Herrera's platoon could not command a man to crawl into near-certain death. They could only watch, understand the necessity of the action, and prepare to support it however they could. True battlefield leadership emerges when individuals recognize a critical need and act upon it, creating momentum where none existed. Herrera's initiative triggered that effect. His movement forced his platoon to re-evaluate their paralysis. Squad leaders adjusted their positions, seeking angles to provide as much covering fire as possible without exposing themselves. The platoon's internal structure, built on discipline, trust, and shared experience, began to reawaken as they watched Herrera advance. In that sense, leadership flowed upward, not downward. The courage of one man inspired the resolve of many. Even the German machine gun crew, trained to recognize and exploit hesitation, sensed a shift. The battlefield, once entirely under their control, now showed the first signs of tilting. The crawling soldier refused to stop. The platoon behind him was stirring. A static engagement was transforming into something far more dangerous for the defenders. And as Herrera closed another few yards, the distance left between him and the nest grew short enough that his next movement would mark the transition from approach to assault. What remained now was the decisive moment, the shift from crawling under fire to confronting the heart of the German defense. Herrera's crawl began as a subtle movement in mud, almost indistinguishable from the trembling ground shaken by machine gun fire. But with each deliberate push of his elbows, he closed the distance between himself and the German position that held his platoon hostage. The men behind him watched in stunned silence, their faces pressed into the earth, hearts pounding with the brutal awareness that any sudden shift in the gunner's attention could send bullets stitching across Herrera's body. The MG-42 continued its relentless bursts, sweeping the field in mechanical arcs designed to keep every American pinned. Dirt sprayed across Herrera's helmet as rounds tore into the ground only inches away. The field was not silent between bursts. It breathed, trembled, and hummed with the sharp hiss of bullets passing overhead. Still, he advanced, each inch gained through force of will rather than strength. His world had narrowed completely, mud beneath, gunfire above, and the German nest ahead, a dark pit carved into the earth, flanked by camouflage netting and the hard shapes of ammunition boxes. As he drew closer, the terrain offered the smallest gifts, shallow depressions where the ground dipped from previous shell blasts. Herrera used each one, flattening himself into the wet soil until he blended with the lifeless earth. The German gunner, sensing movement, adjusted the weapon slightly, the barrel swinging toward Herrera's last position. But Herrera had already shifted again, sliding forward during the brief moment when the gunner's sight picture shifted back toward the main body of the platoon. Camouflage was no longer a concept. It was the instinctive ability to become part of the terrain, to move at a pace so slow that the eye failed to catch it. His breathing grew shallow, controlled not by fear but by necessity. Even the rise of his chest could betray him at this range. At 50 yards, the machine gun felt close enough to touch. Herrera could hear the shouted exchanges between the German crew, their voices sharp and urgent as they coordinated bursts and belt changes. The assistant gunner slapped a fresh belt into place, the metallic click carrying clearly across the field. Herrera tensed, knowing the next burst would be long and indiscriminate, raking the ground in search of the figure they now recognized as a threat. The weapon fired again, a blazing stream of rounds slicing into the earth only a body length away. Mud struck Herrera's face, cold and stinging. But the burst also gave him what he needed: noise. While the world thundered around him, he surged forward 3 feet, dragging his M1 Garand beside him. When he halted again, he was within grenade range. The machine gun nest stood before him now, a shadowed hollow reinforced with timber, the muzzle of the MG-42 protruding like the snout of a metal predator. The Germans inside were unaware of how close he had come. Their focus remained on suppressing the platoon behind him. Herrera steadied his breathing, reached for a grenade, and felt its cold weight fill his hand. There was no time for fear. No room for second thoughts. In one fluid motion, he pulled the pin, rose partially from the mud, and hurled the grenade into the nest. For a fraction of a second, the German gunner hesitated, realizing too late what had happened. The explosion ripped through the position, the shockwave bursting outward with a dull, concussive thud that momentarily silenced the battlefield. The MG-42 went quiet. For a brief moment, there was only ringing in the ears, drifting smoke, and the stunned disbelief of men who had just witnessed the impossible. Herrera exhaled once, steadying himself, his body trembling not from fear but from the release of months of instinct and training compressed into a single decisive act. Behind him, his platoon lifted their heads cautiously, eyes wide with a mix of relief and awe. The first nest, the one that had pinned them to the ground and threatened to halt their advance, was gone. But the silence did not last. From the right flank, another burst shattered the moment, spraying the area with renewed fury. A second machine gun nest, previously dormant or deliberately holding fire, now unleashed its assault. The Germans had prepared overlapping arcs, and with the first gun destroyed, the second now dominated the field. Herrera turned toward the new threat, understanding instantly that the job was not done. The men behind him were still in danger. The path forward remained blocked. And as the second gun opened fire, its sharp, echoing bursts tore through the smoke of the first explosion, signaling that Herrera's assault, far from over, was about to enter its most perilous phase. The smoke from the shattered first nest had barely begun to settle when the second machine gun roared to life, its bursts sharper and more deliberate, as if the German crew understood fully that the destruction of their companion position meant the battle had shifted onto their shoulders alone. The rounds snapped across the field, striking splintered trees, ricocheting off frozen soil, and forcing Herrera's platoon to flatten themselves once more. But Herrera did not retreat. He had barely caught his breath from the first assault when he pressed his palms once again into the mud, lifting his head just enough to gauge the direction of the new fire. The second nest was set deeper into the right flank, positioned to catch any attacker who survived the first position's fire. It was a calculated defensive layout, one gun to halt the advance, another to annihilate anyone who broke through. And now Herrera, still half covered in debris from the explosion he had caused, prepared to face this second threat alone. He began to crawl again, the movement slower this time, his muscles trembling from exertion and adrenaline. The field ahead looked impossibly long, scarred by previous shell bursts and pocked with earth where bullets had struck just moments earlier. The German crew shifted their fire intermittently, alternating between the platoon and the small figure moving toward them, uncertain whether they were seeing deliberate motion or the twitching of battlefield debris. Herrera knew he could not count on their confusion lasting. He pushed forward, chasing the faint cover provided by smoke drifting from the destroyed nest. For several yards it shielded him, cloaking his approach in shifting gray. Then, as the smoke thinned, he found himself exposed again. He pressed as low as he could, every inch gained a negotiation with death. Then it happened, an instant so abrupt the world fractured around him. Herrera felt the earth explode beneath his feet, a violent flash of force that lifted him off the ground and dropped him back into the mud in a confusion of sound and heat. He did not hear the mine, he felt it. Felt the sharp, searing pain that tore through his legs, felt the sickening absence where his feet had been, felt the cold mud suddenly warm beneath him as blood began to flow. The shock was immense, overwhelming, and yet the gunfire did not stop. The MG-42 continued its merciless bursts, indifferent to his suffering. Herrera's vision blurred, but he understood instantly what had happened. He was in a minefield, the invisible barrier the Germans had laid to protect their second gun. For a moment he lay still, the pain radiating upward like fire traveling along his nerves. Another man might have surrendered to the shock, waited for medics, or accepted that the assault had ended. But Herrera's mind refused to detach from the mission. His platoon remained pinned. The machine gun was still firing. His injuries existed, but the danger to his comrades remained unchanged. Gritting his teeth, he pushed his torso upright, dragging what remained of his legs behind him. The act was agonizing, each movement sending new waves of pain through his body. Yet he advanced, not standing, not crawling, but pulling himself forward on his knees, leaving a dark trail in the mud. The German crew saw him now, clearly, unmistakably. Their disbelief hardened into urgency. The gunner adjusted his aim, directing fire toward the wounded figure coming toward them. Bullets ripped into the ground beside Herrera, showering him with mud. He leaned to one side, then the other, using the uneven ground to disrupt the gunner's accuracy. Every motion demanded strength he no longer possessed, but some force beyond strength compelled him. His rifle hung from his shoulder, clattering against rocks as he moved. He released one hand from the mud long enough to clutch it, working the action, chambering around through trembling fingers. At 30 yards, he fired, not with the precision of a marksman, but with the determination of a man denying death its timing. The shots struck the lip of the German position, peppering its front with splinters of wood and earth. The gunner flinched, instinctively lowering his head. Herrera pulled himself forward again, closing the distance foot by foot, knee by knee. At this range, even a wounded man was a lethal threat. The Germans knew it. The assistant gunner reached for a grenade, intending to finish the fight quickly, but Herrera raised his rifle once more, firing until the clip pinged empty. He was close enough now. With hands slick from blood and mud, he reached for another grenade. The pin came free with a ragged pull. Herrera dragged himself the final yards, the machine gun still firing in scattered, panicked bursts. Using the last reserve of strength his body held, he lifted the grenade and hurled it into the second nest. The explosion erupted with a deafening crack, the force of it rolling outward and silencing the MG-42 in an instant. The gun that had dominated the field fell silent, its crew incapacitated, its threat extinguished. The battlefield, for the first time in what felt like hours, quieted. Herrera collapsed onto his side, exhausted, bleeding heavily, the mud cold against his cheek. Behind him, his platoon rose cautiously, realizing the impossible had happened twice. 2 machine gun nests neutralized by a single man. Medics sprinted forward, calling his name, their voices distant through the haze settling over his senses. But Herrera's gaze remained fixed on the nest he had just silenced, as if confirming that his effort had held, that his sacrifice had opened a path for the men who depended on him. And as the platoon surged past him to secure the ground he had won, the full weight of what he had done settled into the silence left behind by the final echo of the MG-42. The medics reached Herrera within moments, their boots sinking into the churned mud as they dropped beside him. His trousers were soaked with blood, torn open where the mine blast had taken both his feet. The smell of explosives, earth, and iron mixed in the cold air as they worked quickly, applying tourniquets, packing bandages, and murmuring reassurances he could barely hear. Herrera drifted in and out of clarity, the edges of his vision blurring, but the adrenaline that had carried him forward still pulsed faintly through his limbs. Around him, the field had transformed. The machine guns that once dominated the landscape were silent ruins. His platoon, moments ago pinned and helpless, was now advancing past him, moving into the ground he had carved open with his own body. Several men paused as they passed, their faces etched with awe and something deeper, the quiet, stunned gratitude of soldiers who knew their lives had been saved not by strategy or luck, but by the impossible courage of one man. They carried Herrera back across the field on a stretcher, weaving through the very terrain he had crawled and bled across. Each jolt of movement radiated pain through his legs, but he gripped the canvas sides tightly, determined not to let his voice betray the agony burning through him. The sounds of battle faded gradually, rifle shots, shouted commands, the distant rumble of artillery, replaced by the steady breaths of the medics and the faint rustle of wind through broken branches. When they reached the aid station, doctors moved swiftly to stabilize him, transfusing blood, administering morphine, and preparing him for evacuation. Herrera felt consciousness slipping like sand between his fingers, yet even in his fading awareness he sensed the shift around him. The way the medical staff glanced at him with a mixture of shock and reverence, the way soldiers whispered his story before he had even left the battlefield. From the front line he was transported through a chain of medical facilities, first an evacuation hospital, then a surgical ward, where surgeons worked to clean and close the wounds that would never fully heal. He awoke days later with the understanding that his life had been permanently altered. The war had taken both of his feet, but not his resolve. Nurses described the battle to him in fragments, each piece confirming what he remembered only in flashes: the crawl, the explosion, the second assault on his knees. Officers visited, their expressions solemn as they thanked him on behalf of the division. But Herrera spoke little. For him, the event did not feel like heroism. It felt like necessity, something any man would have done to save those he served beside. Back in his unit, word of his survival spread quickly. Men who had witnessed his assault recounted the sight with a mixture of disbelief and reverence, their voices rising unconsciously as they retold how he had destroyed one of the deadliest defensive positions any of them had ever faced. To them, Herrera had not simply acted bravely, he had redefined what bravery meant. Yet the man at the center of the legend remained quietly humble, speaking more about the platoon than about himself, refusing to cast his actions in anything other than the plain truth. They were pinned, and someone had to move. Months later, in the calm splendor of the White House, Herrera stood, balanced on newly fitted prosthetic legs, as President Harry S. Truman presented him the Medal of Honor. The contrast between that solemn ceremony and the mud-soaked field of Mertzwiller could not have been greater, yet the story binding them was the same. Truman, known for his plain-spoken manner, clasped Herrera's hand firmly and told him that he considered him a true hero. Herrera, overwhelmed, could only bow his head slightly, accepting the recognition with the quiet dignity of a man who had never sought glory, only survival. But even as the applause faded and the medal hung heavy on his chest, the memories of that day in Alsace remained vivid. No ceremony could erase the cold mud, the fire of the machine guns, or the moment he felt the earth explode beneath him. Those memories would follow him home, shaping the rest of his life long after the war ended. And the impact of his actions extended far beyond his own recovery, rippling through his division, through the final campaign in Europe, and eventually through the way a nation remembered sacrifice. The destruction of the 2 machine gun nests outside Mertzwiller did more than save a single platoon. It opened a breach in a defensive line carefully constructed by German forces fighting to delay the inevitable Allied advance toward the Rhine. Once the guns were silenced, American infantry poured through the gap, sweeping into the village with renewed energy. What had been a static, pinned formation moments earlier transformed into a moving force reclaiming the initiative. Officers later remarked that Herrera's actions had accelerated the timetable for securing that sector, preventing the Germans from reinforcing or reorganizing their defenses. In the final months of the war, when every hour mattered and every delay risked additional casualties, such breakthroughs carried weight beyond their immediate tactical value. They helped maintain the momentum needed to push Germany back toward its collapsing borders. Across Alsace, the German army fought with the desperation of a force aware that defeat was approaching. Their machine gun nests, minefields, and house-to-house defenses were not intended to win the war but to make the Allied advance as costly as possible. Each village, each hillside, each river crossing became a place where time was bought with the lives of young soldiers ordered to resist until the last moment. The collapse of one defensive position often meant little on the grand scale, yet the cumulative effect of dozens of small American victories, many accomplished by individuals acting with extraordinary initiative, eroded the German ability to maintain coherent resistance. Herrera's assault was one such moment, a single act of defiance against a system built on industrialized killing. Machine guns represented the grim efficiency of modern warfare. One soldier crawling forward represented humanity's refusal to be conquered by it. In the weeks after the action near Mertzwiller, the 36th Infantry Division continued its push eastward, crossing rivers swollen with winter runoff and entering towns where the war's end could almost be felt in the spring air. Reports circulated within the division about the soldier who had silenced 2 MG-42s despite being gravely wounded. His name became part of the division's identity, a reminder of what individuals were capable of under the harshest conditions. At night, in makeshift shelters or abandoned farmhouses, soldiers repeated the story, each telling sharpening the image of Herrera dragging himself forward through a minefield despite unimaginable pain. These stories were not exaggerations. Official records would later confirm every detail. But more importantly, they served a deeper purpose. They reinforced morale, reminding men exhausted by months of fighting that courage was not an abstract concept but a real force that shaped battles. Historians later noted how such acts influenced not only the outcome of specific engagements but also the psychological landscape of warfare. Heroism, though rare, had the power to shift perceptions within entire units. Commanders understood this. They documented these actions, cited them in after-action reports, and used them as examples in training manuals long after the war ended. The story of Herrera became part of the military's institutional memory, taught to future generations of soldiers learning about small unit tactics, leadership under fire, and the unpredictable nature of courage. His crawl across the field was more than a personal triumph. It became a case study in initiative, determination, and the power of individual action to break tactical deadlock. Beyond the military sphere, Herrera's legacy found its place in the broader narrative of World War II. In a conflict defined by massive armies, vast fronts, and staggering casualty numbers, his actions offered a counterpoint to the overwhelming scale of the war. They reminded the public that behind every advance on a map stood the sacrifices of individuals who faced death at arm's length. His story echoed in veterans' halls, in community gatherings, and eventually in classrooms where younger generations learned about the cost of freedom. For many, he represented the quiet heroism often overlooked in the shadow of larger events. As the years passed and the war receded into memory, Herrera's actions continued to resonate because they embodied a universal truth. History is shaped not only by generals, strategies, and nations, but by the moments when ordinary people confront extraordinary challenges. His crawl through the mud of Alsace, his assault on 2 machine gun nests, and his refusal to stop even after a mine shattered his legs, these formed a narrative that endured long after the guns of Europe fell silent. And in that endurance, his legacy came to symbolize far more than a single battlefield victory. It came to represent the enduring strength of human will in the face of overwhelming odds. And it is from this legacy, carried forward through decades of remembrance, that we can now step back and reflect on what Herrera's actions truly meant, both for the world he fought in and the generations that followed. In the long arc of history, wars are often recalled through sweeping movements, armies advancing, cities falling, borders redrawn. Yet the true essence of combat is found not in the scale of continents but in the narrow, unforgiving spaces where individual lives intersect with forces far larger than themselves. Silvestre Herrera's crawl across the muddy field outside Mertzwiller stands as one of those rare moments when a single human being, armed with nothing more than determination and a belief in protecting those beside him, altered the shape of a battlefield. Modern warfare, with its machines, its calculations, and its brutal efficiency, often diminishes the role of the individual. But Herrera's actions remind us that technology, no matter how lethal, cannot entirely suppress the human spirit. The MG-42 was engineered to dominate open ground, to turn courage into folly. Yet it could not stop one man who refused to retreat. His story endures because it bridges the distance between ordinary life and extraordinary action. Herrera had not been born into war. He had worked fields, lived quietly, hoped for nothing more than a simple existence. And still, when the moment demanded it, he stepped into a role no training manual could teach. His sacrifice, marked permanently on his body, became a testament to the reality that heroism is rarely sought. It arises from necessity, shaped by loyalty, fear, and love for one's comrades. In this way, Herrera's crawl was not only a tactical breakthrough, it was a profound human statement that in the darkest moments, someone will stand, or crawl, for others. As history moves forward, and the voices of World War II grow fewer with each passing year, stories like Herrera's serve as anchors, reminding us that the cost of freedom is not measured in grand speeches or monuments alone, but in the quiet, relentless courage of individuals who faced impossible choices. His actions in March 1945 echo not because they were spectacular, but because they were deeply human. And as long as we remember that truth, his crawl across that cold Alsatian field will continue to remind us of the enduring power of one person's resolve against the machinery of war.